The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. So, some time ago, I made a video discussing The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. In that video, I believe I said that that book was probably the first real example of what we would later come to call Lovecraftian horror. That was erroneous of me to say that because I was completely completely forgetting about this book, The King in Yellow. I want to amend my previous claim and say that I think this book right here is probably the first true example of what H.P. Lovecraft would later make his own, and what we would later denote as Lovecraftian horror, or cosmic horror, if you will. This is not a novel. This is a short story collection of 10 stories, which are partially linked together to some degree or other. I'll explain that later. But again, I just want to reiterate that this book right here is probably the true dawn of what we would later call Lovecraftian horror. This is Robert W. Chambers's, I guess you would say, his masterpiece. It is certainly the most famous and unquestionably the most influential thing that he ever wrote. And at this point in time, it's really all he's remembered for. I don't even know how many of his other works are even in print. All I know is that The King in Yellow is his most well-known and most highly regarded work, because it really heralded a new breed of weird fiction and horror fiction later on. So, what is The King in Yellow about? Well, as I said, this is not a novel. So if you're expecting me to give a concise, thorough summary, I can't do that, because this is not a novel. This is 10 short stories which are kind of linked together. The first 4 stories are the most important. I want to say this too. Robert W. Chambers, he changed over the course of his writing career. He began writing. This was one of his earlier works, I believe. When he began writing, he initially produced works akin to this, which is weird fiction, or cosmic horror, if you will. But he did not end his career in writing the same stuff. He shifted mid-career into writing more romantic books, both romantic with a capital R, as in like books that could be classed under the romantic movement, as well as literally like romance novels, with a much more lighthearted bent. I think at least in this book, in this edition of this book right here, it says that in the back of this, it says that Robert W. Chambers really kind of invented the rom-com a little bit, because his later works were very lighthearted, kind of romantic affairs. This book is not that, not entirely. I want to mention how he changed over the course of his career, because this book itself kind of is a condensed version of his career. The first 4 stories in this book are the good stuff. That's the reason why this is remembered. The last 6 stories in this book are not of the same. They're not the same type of stuff. Let me explain. So the first 4 stories in this book, the first story being The Repairer of Reputations, which is a very well-regarded and very influential story, which you can really see the influence that it had upon H.P. Lovecraft if you read any of his works, because that could have been a Lovecraft story. But I'm not going to give you any real deep plot summaries. It's just know that the first 4 stories are the weird fiction stories. This is where the book gets its title of The King in Yellow. Each of the first 4 stories, while they have separate plots, I think 3 out of the 4 of them are definitely horror themed stories. One of them is more romantic in nature, but they all are linked by the common motif of the King in Yellow. So what is the King in Yellow? Well, the King in Yellow in this book, or in the first 4 stories of this book, is it is a play that if one reads it, it causes one to lose their sanity. Beyond that, there appears to be, especially in the first story, the Repairer of Reputations, which is probably the most famous individual thing that Robert W. Chambers ever wrote. In that story in particular, there is also mention of a literal entity called the King in Yellow, as though the play that the characters reference and talk about in these stories is actually referencing in turn an actual otherworldly entity known as the King in Yellow. Now, these first 4 stories are why this book is remembered as well as it is and why it's so influential, because these stories, they kick ass. They do. They're each about different things, but it becomes almost, I hesitate to call this, I would hesitate to call this like a Mosaic novel, if you know what that is, in which it is a novel composed of short stories, much like Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. If you've ever read that, that would be classed kind of as a Mosaic novel. I would hesitate to call this work that, and I'll explain why, because the latter stories do not keep with the theme of the originals, of the initial 4. But taken by themselves, these first 4 stories do convey almost a mosaic effect. They involve characters who are possibly or probably insane in some of them, or characters dealing kind of interacting with things that may not be of this world. And all throughout these stories, there are references to this play called The King in Yellow, which, if one reads it, it drives one mad. This truly is, I think, the dawn of what we later came to denote as Lovecraftian horror, because it's very kind of similar in theme to like the Necronomicon out of Lovecraft's work. And also, this is a book that I referenced in my own book whenever I was writing. Whenever I was writing my own work, I referenced this early on, and I was always keeping this in the back of my head whenever I was writing it, because my book contains similar themes to this, or at least to some of the stories in this, pertaining to a book that can drive you insane, as well as the name of one of the locations within the book. This book also owes a major debt. Actually, it owes pretty much its very existence to the works of Ambrose Bierce, because that takes a lot of names and lifts a lot of locations out of one of his stories in particular. Now, I said that the first 4 stories are the weird fiction stuff that are all interlinked by the King in Yellow, but after those stories are up, the 5th through the 10th story are markedly different than the first four. It shifts gears into there is no mention of the King in Yellow after story 4, and it shifts into a medley of other genres, such as a war story, a love story, a weird collection of, I guess you would call them prose poems, that aren't really related, or I guess everything in this book is kind of related to each other, because nearly every story in this book takes place in Paris, in particular in the Latin Quarter of Paris around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, which Robert Chambers himself was quite familiar with, having gone there to study art as a young man. And as I'm given to understand it, due to the explanatory footnotes which are included in this edition of The King in Yellow, many of these characters that appear in these later stories in this work are actually characters from his other books, his earlier novels. I wouldn't know anything about that because I've never read anything else by him. But the style and the tone changes rapidly after the fourth story, and it becomes just a mixture of generally much more lighthearted. There is a war story set during the Franco-Prussian War. Then there is a love story. There's a time travel story in here. But the last three stories take place. The last three stories are definitely interlinked because they contain the same characters. But I am so confused as to whether this is meant to be viewed as a single interconnected work, or whether these stories are meant to be taken individually as separate stories. Because, that's my biggest complaint with this. And I liked this work. I'm gonna say right now, if I had to rate this, I would give this a good solid B. Good solid B. All the stories in here are very well written, and they have had an immeasurable influence on later writers. However, my biggest complaint with this is that it just it's kind of disjointed. Like the way that he interlinked the first four stories with The King in Yellow, and how those were all related and kind of told a bigger story by constantly referencing this mysterious book. That was great. That was what I wanted. That's why you come to read this book. That's why you come to read this book, is because you want to experience that weirdness and the macabreness of it. But then after that, it's just like he just gave up, and he was like, "I'm just going to write some other stories now." It's like, what were you trying to do? You could have made this. I wanted more of The King in Yellow, because he teases us, he tantalizes us with these hints and veiled references to this play that can drive people mad. Which I also want to say, maybe it's not a good idea to publish books that can deprive people of their sanity. Because within this book, The King in Yellow it's not like the Necronomicon, where it's just this mysterious book that only certain people have. It's a regularly published book that you can just buy in a store. But maybe that's not the best idea, to sell books that can, destroy people's minds. But, that's just me. But anyway, so I actually ended up wanting more of The King in Yellow out of this, because that stuff kind of stops after the fourth story. But I do kind of think that all these, I got the impression that all of these stories are kind of interlinked. All of them, even the ones that don't mention The King in Yellow, because the latter stories pretty much all feature the same characters over and over again in the same setting. And there is reference to locations that in which the first 4 stories take place. So I just don't know where to stand. Is it meant to be viewed as one large cohesive work, or is it just a disjointed mess of stories that kind of relate but kind of don't? I don't know. All I know is that this book really is pretty dope. Like, this is a dope little book. This edition right here, which is it contains lots of explanatory notes, and it contains a lot of footnotes to explain some terms, because there's a lot of French in this, which I wouldn't have known because so much of it takes place in Paris. But there's an introduction by Nick Pizzolatto, who wrote True Detective. If you've ever seen season 1 of True Detective, you'll know that the King in Yellow plays a major role in that story. He introduces this, and it's really just a good little addition. It gave me everything I needed to really understand it, and I can definitely see the impact these stories have had, because they're very, well, the first 4 at least, they're very important. They really showcased and a great imagination at work. And I just wish that he hadn't. I wish that he had have continued with what this book was initially, because it just kind of morphs halfway through into something completely different. And I was like, why would you do that? You had this great atmospheric motif that you were using, and that was tying all this together, so it created a bigger effect than each of the stories did by themselves, and then you just kind of gave up halfway through and changed gears into writing a romance story and a time travel story and I mean, it's just odd. And then, all the last stories are good. There's really not a bad story. Well, yes, there was the story called The Prophet's Paradise. I think that's the name of it, where it's literally just a bunch of rambling nonsense. Basically, that was pretty bad. But other than 9 out of 10 of these stories, if I was to rank it, 9 out of 10 of these stories are actually pretty good. A couple of them didn't really go anywhere, but especially the first 4, especially the first 4 stories that actually reference the King in Yellow, those are classics. Like, those stories created an entire movement, pretty much. And you could really see the influence on H.P. Lovecraft in this. But as much as I liked this work, and I really did like it, overall, I kind of wanted it to, you could have made this book, like Chambers, you could have made this book be more than the sum of its parts if you had have kept the King in Yellow going and kept writing more stories in that vein and tied everything together with that motif, but you didn't. You just kind of petered out halfway and was like, I'm going to switch it up and write some other stuff in here, and it kind of just ruined the overall effect that this book had. But by and large, this was a very enjoyable book, very enjoyable read. I do not regret buying it, and it did have a major influence on me, especially when I was writing my own thing, because I made pretty heavy reference to this. And this, in turn, makes pretty heavy reference to the works of Ambrose Bierce. But, yeah, that is The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Have you read The King in Yellow? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. If you agree with my take on it. If you don't, let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you have not read The King in Yellow, you might want to, maybe. It's definitely a good read. I don't think you'll be bored or anything. Well, okay, the last few stories got kind of boring, but overall, it's very enjoyable. It's not going to take up too much of your time. I read this in 2 days. It's not a long book. It's only 10 stories. And it's nice to see where I think Lovecraftian horror really got going. At least with the first 4 stories in this collection, because that really is, I think, the dawn of that movement. But anyway, if you read The King in Yellow, let me know what you thought about it. If you haven't, you might want to check it out. I think a lot of people out there would enjoy it. And as always, remember to like and subscribe. And until next time, goodbye.